How did Boris do? And I suppose the best way to assess it is, did it pass the sniff test?
Well, I think with this partygate inquiry, who hadn't made up their minds already before the event, I don't think that Boris will have changed anyone's mind with his fairly unconvincing excuses. But I also don't think that the people grilling him will have changed anyone's mind who thinks he, has been hard done by, because his team say it's, a bit of a stitch-up. No one is. So in that sense, it's not going to move the dial significantly on public opinion.
Maybe not on public opinion, but if that is correct, if it hasn't changed anyone's minds, then he's done for, isn't he? Because the Privileges Committee quite clearly showed disbelief in their questioning.
He could be in trouble. There's different ways that he could be punished. So he could be suspended. If he's suspended for a certain amount of time, that could trigger a by-election. I think that seems unlikely. That seems like an overly harsh punishment. He may be found to have recklessly misled Parliament in the jargon, rather than deliberately misled Parliament. But, I think at the end of the day, I think we've all made up our minds as to whether he was telling the truth or not. Johnson's excuse is that number 10 was a Victorian house, it's super cramped, no one was really able to social distance in it, and he claims that the rules allowed for that. I'm not convinced that will wash with most people.
What is the public appetite on this? We can understand him being brought to book, brought to heel within the House. Outside the House, what do you think people are thinking, or do they care?
I think people definitely cared when Partygate was first revealed. I think especially, remember when we saw that Allegra Stratton video where she was seen to be sort of laughing at the parties? I think that unleashed, quite rightly, a lot of public anger. People had been prevented from seeing loved ones, prevented from having just an ordinary social life, and knowing that, the people who made the rules were laughing and joking at them, that obviously upset people. But from now on, we've been raking over the coals of this incident for months on end now. I think people would want to move on. If we are going to be discussing the COVID period, shouldn't we be discussing the rules themselves? They seem to have had nowhere near enough scrutiny. Considering the amount of liberties that we gave up, considering the harms that were caused to health and to schooling. That seems to me a much more important thing to be discussing. Where's the inquiry over these lockdown files into Matt Hancock's texts? MPs should have been discussing that, I think, instead of spending 4 hours on Partygate.
YouGov issued a poll yesterday afternoon. Do you think Boris Johnson is honest or dishonest? Of Conservative voters, 51% said dishonest, and of the general public, that went up to 72%. Speaks volumes.
Yeah, that's hardly surprising. Again, I don't think anyone is buying Boris Johnson's defence. I think everyone could see that these parties were, not above board. And, he's resting on some real technicalities. You can see he's actually been quite careful in his phrasing about talking about who he asked. He always talks about he implicitly believed. That's not a normal thing to say. That's a very legalistic kind of way of getting out of saying I didn't think that they were parties, because everyone else can see that they were.
What about when he was questioned, do you think this is a kangaroo court? And he essentially said he would only trust the Privileges Committee if they let him off.
Yeah, heads I win, tails you lose type situation. His argument is that Harriet Harman had essentially already said he was guilty, which is not good. The Privilege Committee isn't a proper court, thankfully. If it were, then yes, you would be a bit worried about it. But MPs are always going to have their own. They're always going to bring their own political judgments to bear on these issues.
But it was the Conservatives, Sir Bernard Jenkin, who was probably the toughest and got the most upset out of him, wasn't it?
Definitely. But now the Tories are so split. And have been for several years now, especially over Brexit, that if you're of the Boris camp, you could also dismiss that as part of the cabal. So he will always wriggle out of it.
Let's talk about that. It was a huge government win on that Brexit vote.
Huge.
Yesterday.